September 19th, 41. Ottawa, Canada. Rain taps against the windows of a government recruiting office on Wellington Street. Inside, a young woman sits across from a recruitment officer, her fingers gripping the edge of a wooden chair. She has come here expecting to fill a clerical role, something safe, something close to home. The officer slides a form across the desk. The Canadian Women's Army Corps, he says. Service on Canadian soil. Non-combatant duties. She signs her name, believing the war will stay an ocean away. She does not know that within 18 months, she will stand on the deck of a troopship crossing the North Atlantic, headed toward a city still scarred by fire and rubble. She does not know that the promise of home service will dissolve, and that the needs of a war-torn capital will demand more than anyone anticipated. In the summer of 1941, Canada faced a manpower crisis. The war in Europe had entered its third year, and every branch of the armed forces reported shortages. Men were needed at the front, in factories, on farms, and in supply lines stretching across two hemispheres. The solution, officials agreed, was to enlist women, not for combat, but to free men for combat roles. On August 13, 1941, the Canadian Women's Army Corps was officially established. It was not the first women's military organization in Canadian history, but it was the first to be fully integrated into the Army structure. Women could now wear uniforms, receive military training, and serve under military discipline, but the terms were clear. Service would be restricted to Canadian soil, non-combatant roles only, no overseas deployments. The announcement drew mixed reactions. Some praised it as a necessary step. Others questioned whether women belonged in uniform at all. Editorials debated propriety, capability, and tradition. But applications poured in. Within weeks, hundreds of women lined up at recruiting stations in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Halifax. They came from farms, offices, factories, and classrooms. Some were motivated by patriotism. Others sought adventure, independence, or a steady paycheck. All believed they were signing up for work at home. The Canadian Women's Army Corps, or CWAC, began training recruits at makeshift facilities across the country. Women learned to march, salute, and follow orders. They studied military protocol, radio operation, and vehicle maintenance. They drilled in all weather, lived in barracks, and adapted to the rhythms of military life. The work was not glamorous. They sorted mail, answered telephones, typed reports, and operated switchboards. They repaired vehicles, loaded supplies, and managed inventories. Every task they performed freed a man to deploy overseas. By the end of 1941, the CWAK had enlisted more than 1,000 women. By mid-1942, that number had doubled. The organization expanded rapidly, creating new training centers and opening roles in communications, transport, and administration. Women served at military bases from coast to coast. They became part of the war effort, even if the front lines remained far away. But across the Atlantic, the situation in Britain was growing more desperate. The German bombing campaign known as the Blitz had battered London and other cities throughout 1940 and into 1941. Tens of thousands of civilians had been killed. Homes, factories, and infrastructure lay in ruins. British military resources were stretched thin. The Royal Air Force was locked in a daily struggle for air superiority. The army was preparing for the possibility of invasion. Every available soldier was needed for defense, for reconstruction, and for the coming offenses in North Africa and Europe. British women had already been mobilized in large numbers. The Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Women's Royal Naval Service, and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force all recruited heavily. But demand still exceeded supply. British officials began looking to the Dominions for support. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada were asked to consider sending women to serve in Britain. The request was unprecedented. No Canadian women had ever been deployed overseas in an official military capacity. In Ottawa, military planners debated the idea. Some argued that sending women abroad violated the original terms of the CWAC. Others pointed out that the war had changed, and so had the needs of the Allies. If Britain needed help, Canada would provide it. In early 1942, the government quietly authorized the deployment of CWAC personnel to the United Kingdom. The announcement was delayed. Recruits were not immediately informed. But plans were already in motion. The first wave of CWAC members selected for overseas service received their orders in the spring of 1942. Many were shocked. They had enlisted with the explicit understanding that they would remain in Canada. Some protested, others resigned, but most accepted the orders, driven by duty, loyalty, or the simple reality that military service meant following commands. The women chosen for deployment were drawn from across the country. They included clerks, drivers, radio operators, and technicians. They ranged in age from their early 20s to their late 30s. Some were married. A few had children. All underwent additional training before departure, including courses on wartime security, convoy procedures, and survival at sea. They packed their kits, said goodbye to families, and boarded trains bound for Halifax. The journey across the Atlantic was dangerous. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, sinking Allied vessels with regularity. Convoys moved in zigzag patterns to evade torpedoes. Ships traveled in blackout conditions, their portholes covered, their decks silent. The CWHA members aboard were given life jackets and assigned to lifeboats, but they knew the odds. If a ship went down in the North Atlantic, survival time in the water was measured in minutes. The crossing took between 8 and 12 days, depending on weather and routing. The conditions aboard were cramped and uncomfortable. Sleeping quarters were shared, meals were rationed. Seasickness was common. But the women adapted. They organized entertainment, held sing-alongs, and maintained morale. Some kept journals. Others wrote letters they hoped to mail upon arrival. They did not know what awaited them in Britain, but they knew it would be different from anything they had experienced in Canada. When the first troopship carrying CWAC personnel reached Liverpool in the summer of 1942, the women disembarked into a country transformed by war. Bomb craters put to docks. Buildings stood hollow and blackened. Civilians moved through the streets with quiet determination, their faces marked by exhaustion and loss. The CWAC members were transported by rail to London, where they were assigned to Canadian military headquarters and various support units scattered across southern England. London bore the scars of the Blitz more visibly than any other city. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. St. Paul's Cathedral stood intact, but much of the surrounding area had been flattened. Anti-aircraft guns lined rooftops. Barrage balloons floated overhead. Air raid sirens still sounded, though the worst of the bombing had passed. The city was learning to live with the threat of attack, to carry on despite the constant presence of danger. The CWAC women were assigned to roles similar to those they had held in Canada: clerical work, communications, transport. But the context was vastly different. They worked in offices that had been bombed and rebuilt. They drove supply trucks through streets scarred by fire. They operated switchboards that connected commanders planning the next phase of the war. The work was routine in nature, but essential in function. Every message relayed, every document filed, every vehicle maintained, contributed to the larger effort. They lived in barracks, hostels, and requisition buildings. They shared meals in canteens and attended briefings alongside British and other Allied personnel. They navigated blackout regulations, rationing, and the constant disruptions of wartime life. They learned to recognize the sound of German bombers, to distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft, and to find shelter when the sirens wailed. The deployment was not without controversy. In Canada, families questioned why their daughters and sisters had been sent overseas when they had been promised home service. Newspapers ran stories about broken commitments. Some members of Parliament demanded explanations. The military responded with carefully worded statements about the evolving nature of the conflict and the urgent needs of Allied forces. The debate continued, but the deployments did not stop. By the end of 1942, more than 600 CWAC members were serving in Britain. By 1943, that number had grown to nearly 2,000. They worked in London, Aldershot, and other military centers. They served at headquarters, supply depots, and communications hubs. They became a visible part of the Canadian military presence in Europe, even if their contributions often went unrecognized in official accounts. The women faced challenges their male counterparts did not. They dealt with skepticism from officers who doubted their abilities. They navigated social expectations that cast their presence overseas as improper or unnecessary. They encountered hostility from civilians who resented the arrival of foreign troops, even Allied ones. And they confronted the simple, grinding reality of life in a war zone, the constant threat of attack, the scarcity of basic goods, the relentless pressure of work that never stopped. But they also found solidarity. They formed friendships that would last lifetimes. They supported one another through homesickness, fear, and exhaustion. They shared rations, swapped stories, and celebrated small victories. They proved, day after day, that they could perform the work required of them, under conditions few had imagined when they first signed up. The majority of CWAC members in Britain were assigned to clerical roles. They typed orders, filed reports, and maintained records for Canadian military headquarters and other units. The work was repetitive and often tedious, but it was also critical. Every operation, every deployment, every supply shipment required documentation. Without accurate records, the logistics of war would collapse. The women worked long hours, often 6 days a week. They sat at desks in drafty offices, typing on manual machines that jammed and broke. They sorted through mountains of paperwork, cross-referencing dates, names, and unit numbers. They answered phones, relayed messages, and kept track of personnel movements across multiple theaters of war. The work demanded precision, patience, and attention to detail. Mistakes could have serious consequences. Many of the clerks had worked in similar roles in civilian life, but the military environment was different. They operated under strict security protocols. They could not discuss their work outside the office. They handled classified documents and learned to recognize the difference between routine correspondence and intelligence material. They adapted to the rhythms of military life, where everything moved according to orders and schedules. A smaller but highly visible group of CWAC members served as drivers and mechanics. They operated trucks, ambulances, and staff cars, transporting personnel and supplies across southern England. They learned to navigate blacked-out roads at night, to repair vehicles in the field, and to keep their equipment running despite shortages of parts and fuel. The work was physically demanding. I changed tires, checked engines, and performed maintenance in all weather. They drove long distances on narrow roads, often through areas that had been bombed. They dealt with breakdowns, accidents, and the constant wear that military operations imposed on vehicles. They worked alongside male drivers and mechanics, earning grudging respect through competence and reliability. Some of the women had never driven a vehicle before joining the CWAC. They learned on the job, training on military bases in Canada before deploying overseas. By the time they reached Britain, they were capable drivers, able to handle heavy trucks and navigate difficult terrain. They took pride in their work and in the independence it gave them. CWAC radio operators and switchboard personnel played a vital role in maintaining communication between Canadian units and Allied command. They operated radio equipment, relayed coded messages, and ensured that critical information reached its destination quickly and securely. They worked in shifts around the clock, monitoring frequencies and coordinating transmissions. The work required technical skill and concentration. Radio operators had to master Morse code, recognize signal patterns, and troubleshoot equipment failures. Switchboard operators managed complex networks of phone lines, connecting calls across multiple locations and prioritizing urgent traffic. They operated under pressure, knowing that delays or errors could disrupt operations. Many of the communicators had received specialized training before deploying. They studied radio theory, cryptography, and signal security. They practiced in simulated conditions, preparing for the chaos and urgency of real operations. By the time they arrived in Britain, they were proficient in their roles, capable of handling the demands of wartime communication. Life in Britain was a culture shock for many CWH members. They had grown up in a country where war was distant, experienced through newsreels and radio broadcasts. Now they lived in a nation that had endured years of bombing, rationing, and loss. They saw the physical evidence of war everywhere: ruined buildings, barrage balloons, blackout curtains, and the quiet exhaustion on civilian faces. They adapted to British customs and routines. They learned to navigate the tube, to queue patiently for rationed goods, and to drink tea at every opportunity. They attended dances organized by military welfare organizations, where they met British soldiers, American GIs, and other Allied personnel. They explored London on their days off, visiting museums, theaters, and historic sites, even as they remained aware of the ever-present threat of air raids. They also faced homesickness. Letters from Canada took weeks to arrive. News from home was delayed and often incomplete. They worried about families, friends, and the lives they had left behind. Some struggled with the isolation, the distance, and the uncertainty of when, or if, they would return. Although the worst of the Blitz had passed by the time most CWAC members arrived, the threat of German attack remained. V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets struck London and other cities throughout 1944 and into 1945. The weapons arrived without warning, delivering devastating blasts that killed and injured hundreds. CWAC members learned to live with the threat. They carried gas masks. They knew the location of the nearest shelter. They listened for the distinctive engine sound of a V-1, knowing that when the engine cut out, the bomb would drop. They developed a fatalistic calm, continuing their work even as explosions echoed in the distance. Some experienced near misses. A V-1 struck a building near their barracks. A V-2 exploded blocks from their workplace. They saw the aftermath, the rubble, the casualties, the stunned survivors. They attended memorial services for comrades killed in attacks. They carried on because there was no other choice. Despite their contributions, CWAC members often faced resistance and skepticism. Some male officers questioned the need for women in uniform. Some British civilians viewed them as interlopers. Some Canadian soldiers resented their presensible, believing that women had no place near a war zone. The women responded with professionalism and persistence. They performed their duties without complaint. They met challenges with competence. They proved, through action, that they belonged. Over time, attitudes began to shift. Officers who had been skeptical came to rely on them. Soldiers who had been dismissive acknowledged their value. Fire prices for help, and inflation. The women earned respect not through rhetoric, but through the quiet, steady accumulation of work well done. By the spring of 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe was imminent. Preparations intensified across southern England. Troops, vehicles, and supplies poured into assembly areas. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, and every available resource was mobilized. CWAC members found themselves working longer hours, handling increased volumes of communication, and supporting the logistics of an invasion that would determine the course of the war. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, CWAC clerks processed mountains of paperwork. They tracked personnel assignments, verified equipment inventories, and ensured every unit had the orders and information it needed. CWAC drivers transported officers to planning meetings and delivered supplies to staging areas. CWA radio operators maintained contact with units scattered across the region, relaying updates and coordinating movements. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. CWAC members in Britain monitored the reports as they came in. They listened to coded transmissions, updated situation maps, and relayed information to headquarters. They worked through the night, aware that every message, every piece of data, contributed to the success or failure of the operation. The invasion succeeded, but the cost was high. Casualty reports arrived in waves, and the women processed them with quiet professionalism, knowing that each name represented a life lost or changed forever.